Hey, Bio 150 folks. So we're going to pick up where we left off talking about how plants regulate their water content. And we're talking about, in general, complex multicellular taxa. So we left off in the previous lecture talking about plants and talking about the different adaptations that plants had to regulate water content and to osmoregulate. And we had already spoken about cell walls and vacuoles. If you've not yet watched those slides in that lecture, please make sure you view those slides in that lecture before you watch this lecture set. So, given that, what's the correct answer here? All right, if you said A, that is the correct response. So vacuoles and cell walls are something that all the green plants have, whether you're a green algae or the land plants. They all have vacuoles and cell walls. And so we talked about vacuoles and cell walls and the roles that they play in water regulation. So now we're going to pick up and talk about specific adaptations that the land plants have, specifically the cuticle, stomata, vascular tissue, and some other structural adaptations that the land plants have. And if you're not sure what I mean when I say land plants, once again, that is reviewed in the previous set of lectures. But we're talking about the green algae, the bryophytes, and the vascular plants. So the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So when we talk about land plants, what we're talking about is that plants had to make a transition onto land. So somewhere way back in the deep evolutionary history of plants, around 500 million years ago, and even before that, initially plants evolved in an aquatic environment. And so the ancient ancestor of land plants back here in the sort of phylogenetic tree of plants may have looked something like this, where it survived underwater. And then around 480 million years ago, plants made the transition onto land. And so there must have been specific adaptations that allowed them to make this transition onto land to give rise to these different groups, that form the land plants. And it may have looked, the earliest land plants may have looked something like this. We don't really know exactly what they would have looked like. But the big obstacles that plants had to deal with in moving from an aquatic environment to surviving in a dry land environment is number one, water loss from evaporation. So now that you're not completely surrounded by water, but you're surrounded by air, you're going to lose a lot of water to evaporation. And also getting water from the soil up to the rest of the plant. So water is surrounding this land plant, obviously, and so it's easy for the rest of the plant to have access to water. It doesn't have to move water around. Whereas here, most of the water exists in the soil, and so water has to move from the soil up to the rest of the plant. And so when we talk about the solutions that plants have evolved, or the adaptations that have allowed plants to deal with these two pressures, there's two major solutions: cuticle and stomata to deal with water loss from evaporation, and vascular tissue to help get water from soil to the rest of the plant. So let's talk about the cuticle and stomata to start. So these are the different adaptations that we've talked about: cell walls and vacuoles. This is where they appear on the phylogenetic tree, and that all of these organisms or all these groups have vacuoles and cell walls. When we add cuticle and stomata to this tree, this is a trait or traits that are unique, but also shared by all of the land plants. So let's talk about what a cuticle and stomata are and what roles they play. So they're very important for preventing water loss. So on land plant cells can lose a ton of water by evaporation. So here, for example, you can see this plant, and when it's in the sun, it's in the heat, there's a lot of water evaporating off of the leaves of plants. And one solution to this water loss issue is something called a cuticle. It's a waxy cuticle, and it basically reduces water loss from plant cells. And so if you look at a typical green algal cell that doesn't have a cuticle, it's sort of a simplified way of looking at it is like this, whereas the typical land plant cell, this is once again a sort of oversimplification, it has this surrounding or a waxy cuticle around it. So if we look at this sort of in more detail of what it actually looks like in a typical land plant. So here's a leaf, you take a cross section of that leaf, and so we're looking at this sort of like little green cross section right here. We can see that it's got these epidermal cells, so these are the cells that are on the outside of the leaf. So this is like the top of the leaf, and this is like the bottom of the leaf, and these are all the cells in the middle in that cross section. And on top of that top epidermis, if we zoom in on this section right here, you can see that it has this waxy layer called a cuticle. And all that is basically a layer of sort of wax and fat and non-living stuff that covers the epidermis, and it's secreted by these epidermal cells. And basically what that cuticle does is it works sort of like a sealant, covering all these above ground parts of the cells, and it dramatically reduces water loss to surrounding air. So there's way less water loss thanks to this waxy cuticle or covering. So given that, it actually turns out that cuticle thickness can also vary for different species of plants that have evolved in different climates. So which plants do you think would have a thicker cuticle given this fact? A cactus in a desert, or some of these tropical plants growing in this very moist environment? All right, if you said A, you are correct. Basically, desert plants have a much thicker cuticle to help reduce water loss in these hot and dry areas. However, there are downsides to having a cuticle. Specifically, cuticles significantly reduce CO2 intake. So basically, because cuticles block water freely moving sort of in and out of plant cells across the cell membranes, the other thing that it also blocks, so it also blocks a lot of other gases or other things that can typically freely move across the cell membrane from being able to get in and out of cells. Specifically, they reduce CO2 intake. So because you have this waxy cuticle, CO2 can't get into plant cells. And recall that CO2 is a really important component for photosynthesis. So in order for plants to do photosynthesis and produce the sugars they need to survive, they need to be able to bring CO2 into the plant. And so having this waxy cuticle reduces CO2 intake. So diffusion is really easy into the cell of, for example, a green algal cell that doesn't have this waxy cuticle. But if you have a waxy cuticle surrounding a typical land plant cell, CO2 can't diffuse through that cell. That's a big issue. And so the answer, the solution that plants have evolved, are stomata. And so once again, looking at the same sort of cross-section, basically what we're looking at is this is the top of the leaf and that waxy cuticle. This is the bottom of that leaf, and these are all the cells in the middle, and this is the epidermal sort of cell layer. And if we zoom in on this epidermal cell layer, we can see that there's this little opening here called a stoma that's composed of this hole that's a pore and these things called guard cells. And so multiple stoma make up what's called stomata. And essentially what stomata are trap doors that are in the epidermis of cuticle that enable CO2 to get in and out, as well as other gases and water as well. And so basically the way stoma work or stomata work is that guard cells can change shape. And so basically what they can do is they have an open high volume state. So you can think of this sort of like an inner tube, like in a tire, or like when you go floating down the river in. If you blow it way up, it takes this big sort of round turgid shape, and it's got a nice hole in the middle that, you know, if you're in an inner tube that you can sit in to float down the river. It's the same way with a stomata. When it blows up, it's got a nice hole in the middle, and that open, high-volume state will allow oxygen, water, and gases to get in and out of the plant's leaves. Whereas it also has a closed, low-volume state, so if you were to deflate that same sort of inner tube, it sort of sinks in on itself, and as a result, that pore or the hole in the stoma closes. And so releasing solutes can cause water to flow out. And so this is all sort of part of osmoregulation. If you bring some solutes in, water will follow it in, it'll blow up, it'll open the hole. If you release solutes or pump solutes out, water will go out and it'll close the hole. And then CO2 and gas exchange, or CO2 can and can't get through. So the key point here is that guard cells in stomata play a key role in water regulation in most land plants. So let me explain that a little bit further. So we learned that guard cells can change shape. So here's a guard cell, here's an individual stoma. And when this thing's open, it allows CO2 to get in for photosynthesis, but also water can escape from the plant. So it's losing water and potentially drying out. Whereas when it's closed, CO2 can't get in, so the plant can't do as much photosynthesis or can't do photosynthesis at all without CO2 getting in. But also it's no longer losing water. So which of the following would you predict based on this? Okay, so if you said these are both true, that is the case. So this is a great example of a trade-off where there's advantages to staying open, but there's also advantages to keeping those stomata closed. And so let's explore this trade-off in a little bit more detail. So the sort of key point here is that plants actually have to balance that water loss with sugar production or photosynthesis. So they need to figure out, at what point am I losing too much water, and at what point am I not producing enough sugars? And you have to balance off that loss of water and the plant drying out potentially with the intake of CO2 so that the plant can do photosynthesis and so that the plant can produce sugars. And stomata help regulate this balance between sugar production through photosynthesis and the intake of CO2 and water loss and losing water through having those open stomata and evaporation of water out of the plant. So this idea that guard cells can change shape, and given this idea, this sort of trade-off, which of the following would you predict? All right, so if you said B, guard cells should stay closed more often in drier conditions to reduce water loss, that is generally the case. So the whole idea here is if you're in a dry environment and a hot environment, typically there's a lot more sunlight available, and typically there's a lot less water available. And so that means that, sunlight and pulling in CO2 is not your limiting resource, and doing photosynthesis is not your limiting resource, and producing sugars is not your limiting resource. Water loss is the limiting resource. And so typically it's going to pay off for a plant in terms of this trade-off to have more guard cells closed and have the guard cells closed more often at the cost of maybe producing a little bit less sugars, but not losing that sort of limiting factor, which is water in this case, okay? And I want to add the caveat that there are some exceptions to this in something called C4 plants, but I don't want to get into those details. I just want you to understand that this trade-off exists and that stomata are a great way to sort of balance off this trade-off between CO2 intake and water loss. Okay, and so together, combined, both the cuticle and the stomata allow land plants to keep photosynthesizing without completely drying out. So these are important adaptations, and this is the sort of take-home message from these two adaptations, is the cuticle reduces water loss, but at the cost of CO2 intake, and then the stomata help to allow CO2 to get in, but also release a little bit of water, and so stomata can open and close to balance that CO2 intake versus water loss. Okay, so where would stomata and cuticle go on this tree? At which point, A, B, C, D, or E? All right. If you said C, you are right. So stomata and cuticle are something that all land plants have. So those adaptations are unique to the land plants, and those adaptations help the land plants move onto land. So they help them deal with this sort of evaporative water loss. So these are very important adaptations that allowed plants to move onto land. And so at this point, we've talked about the major adaptations, or two of the major adaptations that allowed plants to transition onto land, specifically a cuticle and stomata that help plants deal with this major obstacle to surviving on dry land. So this is just to summarize: cuticle and stomata help with this first obstacle, which is water loss from evaporation. What we're going to talk about next in the next sort of set of slides is getting water and soil from the rest of the plant and how vascular tissue have helped land plants do that. Okay, so just once again to sort of put this into the grander picture of what we've been talking about in these last couple of slides and lectures, is we've talked about cell walls and vacuoles being an important role in playing an important role in water regulation. We've also talked about cuticle and stomata, and what we're going to talk about next are these other adaptations, vascular tissue, and some other structural adaptations that land plants have evolved to survive on land.